Welcome to the Play and Talk podcast. I'm your host, Rob Port. A little bit later in the show, Congressman Kelly Armstrong joins us answering questions as he does every week. We talked a lot this week about the Violence Against Women Act. So if you're curious about that, that's been a hot topic in the United States House of Representatives. We could certainly, we talked about it a lot, so you might learn something. Remember, he's on every week along with Senator Kevin Cramer. If you want to submit questions for them, you can email them, rob@sayanythingblog.com. We've been getting a lot of questions, which makes me very happy because that's what that whole thing is about. You folks asking questions. So we've been getting a lot of them. Email them to rob@sayanythingblog.com. Sure appreciate that. Before we get there, though, I want to talk a little bit about the initiated measure process. Now, it sure seems like we're going to get some possible reform to the initiated measure process coming up in the next election cycle. Now, the reason why I say this is the legislature has passed, all right, I should say the State House of Representatives has passed SCR 4001. It's a proposed constitutional amendment that would amend the initiated measure process for constitutional amendments. Remember, there's two types of initiated measures. There's one that has a lower signature standard. You don't have to collect as many signatures for it. It amends state law, right? It amends the century code, what's called statute. There's another type of initiated measure that amends the state constitution, right? So our state constitution is separate from our state statutes. This, what the legislature is passing, would only matter for constitutional amendments. Nothing at all would change for the process for ballot measures changing the century code. Now, what it does is it says that ballot measures amending the Constitution would only be voted on in general elections. The idea being that the general elections, the ones held in November, as opposed to the June primary elections, they get the most voter turnout. So the idea is if we're going to amend the Constitution, we want to put it on the ballot that gets the most voters. I suspect that proposal is not very constitutional. Or, excuse me, not very controversial. The part that I suspect is going to be controversial is the part where it says any constitutional amendment approved on a general election ballot would need to be approved by the next session of the legislature. So let's say that you and I get together, we form a ballot measure committee, we collect signatures, and we put a constitutional amendment on the November 2020 ballot. That's the next general election ballot. If the voters say yes to it, a majority of voters say yes to it, it wouldn't become law. What would happen is the legislative session that begins in January of 2021 would also have to approve it. Both the House and the Senate would have to approve the ballot measure, in which case then it would become law. Now, if they don't approve it, what happens then is it goes back to the ballot again. So the same measure goes to the ballot again, and the voters get another whack at it. And if the voters approve it a second time, then it becomes law. So essentially, it's a big change to the timeline. It's another hurdle, or I guess maybe another two hurdles, to amending the state constitution. And it extends the timeline for amending the Constitution. So, as it is now, you start collecting your signatures and you put it on the ballot. And if it's approved on the ballot, then it becomes law, pretty much right after it gets approved on the ballot. But now you'd have to wait for the legislative session. So now the earliest possible that your constitutional amendment could be approved for the Constitution would be that next summer. So it gets approved in November, let's say in the coming election cycle, it gets approved in November 2020. Your constitutional amendment probably wouldn't become effective till after the legislative session ends in, probably spring of 2021. Now, if the legislature doesn't approve it, well, then you've got to wait till the next election in 2022 and have the voters approve it again, then it becomes law. So changes the timeline, makes it harder, and honestly, I'm good with that. Now, a lot of people don't agree with that. A lot of people think, well, this is the legislature usurping the power of the people, and it's just the political elites taking money and taking power away from the people. I don't think we were ever supposed to make policy at the ballot box. I frankly would do away, if I had my way, and I realize this is not a popular sentiment, and I don't think that this is something that's even popular among lawmakers, but if I had my way, we'd get rid of the initiated measure process entirely. I think it's a terrible way to make policy. The idea that any random group of people can just collect a bunch of signatures and put their proposal on the ballot, right? And we're going to amend the law, which by the way is very complex. And changing one part of the law can have, side effects for a lot of the different portions of the law. I mean, look at how much sloppy policymaking we've seen get done at the ballot box. Look at Marzy's Law, right? It's supposed to be a victim's right law, but who's using it now to shut down public access to information? Law enforcement, right? The number one users of Marzy's Law in the state of North Dakota are not victims, but law enforcement, claiming that they're victims or in other ways invoking Marzy's Law to keep information from the public. Look at the medical marijuana ballot measure in 2016. So poorly written that as it passed at the ballot, didn't actually decriminalize medical marijuana. In fact, if the legislature hadn't stepped in and fixed it after it passed in 2016, the 2017 legislative session, and they got all sorts of grief for this, unfortunately, from a bunch of partisan hacks and idiots who didn't really understand how the process was working, the legislature had to step in and fix it so that it actually legalized medical marijuana. You know, again and again, we have these really terrible, poorly written ballot measures. We have Measure 1 that passed last year that is going to make it harder for North Dakotans to participate in politics, right? It's going to make it harder for you to engage with your politicians. It's going to make it harder for you to organize and make your voice heard. It's going to be great for the groups that already have lots of money and lawyers. They're not going to be affected, but you and I, right? Just average Joes who are doing this stuff part-time because we care about a given area of public policy, it's going to be harder for us. I mean, that's what's happening. I think policymaking should be hard, and I think it should have checks and balances. And right now, there really aren't any checks and balances in the initiated measure process. I would do away with the initiated measure process entirely. I don't even think checks and balances could fix it. I think it's just a fundamentally stupid way to make public policy. But the legislature is going to try to put in some checks and balances, and that's what they're doing. With this constitutional amendment, they're going to put in some checks and balances. The legislature is going to be a check on what comes out of the ballot box. Because I'm going to tell you, again, people are like, well, it's the will of the people. Well, have you ever seen an election come out in a way that you didn't like? Because I sure have. In my 38 years, I've seen a lot of elections come out ways that I thought were very stupid. The voters aren't infallible. The voters don't always get it right. And so what happens is, by allowing the legislature to weigh in on this as well, it's another set of eyeballs. It's another step in the process so that the voters do something really stupid, like maybe approving a medical marijuana measure. And by the way, I'm totally in favor of legalizing marijuana. I would legalize recreational marijuana. But the legislature, so if the voters pass a stupid medical marijuana measure that has to get fixed so that it actually decriminalizes marijuana, this allows the legislature, to do something like that. Or maybe, for instance, maybe the medical marijuana, because the legislature did step in and fix that one. So maybe let me provide you maybe with a different scenario. We have the legacy fund that's sitting around. It's got billions of dollars in it. Huge pot of money. It's not committed to anything. At some point, political interests with deep pockets could come into the state of North Dakota, spend a few $100,000, collect, pay professional signature collectors or pay temp workers, whoever it is they hire. I can't imagine there's people who do that for a living, but maybe there are. I don't know. But basically pay people to collect their signatures for them, put their issue on the ballot, pay some, slick marketing campaign to throw peanuts at the rubes, right? People who aren't, because let's face it, a lot of people who vote in our elections, they're apathetic. They're not really paying attention. So you go out there, you flood the zone with your marketing. People who think that your proposal, your amendment is a bad idea, right? So maybe they want to come in and they want to spend all the legacy fund money on some stupid project, and all the people opposed to it are going to come together and cobble together their money to try to oppose it. And now it just becomes sort of a game of Russian roulette at the ballot box. What are the voters going to do? I mean, does that sound like a good way to plan how to spend? Because it's possible. You can get 27,000 signatures, put your constitutional amendment on the ballot, and suddenly spend billions of dollars out of the legacy fund if you get enough votes. All you got to get is 50% plus one. That's all it takes. Don't you think maybe we should have a check on that process? Don't you think maybe we should have some balance in that process? Like if we get carried away, if some really slick marketing campaign just completely bamboozles the voters, or maybe something in the media, gets the public's emotions going, right? I mean, we've never seen that happen before, right? The emotions of some event in the news, like Look at the way we talk about gun control every time there's a school shooting, right? I mean, if we voted on gun control immediately after a school shooting, gun control would probably pass every single time it's proposed. Now, it usually doesn't because passing gun control is really, really hard. And many of us think that that's a feature because we shouldn't make laws from a place of emotion. Which is why we shouldn't make laws at the ballot box to begin with. But if we're going to make laws at the ballot box, well, hey, how about we bring some checks and balances to the system? How about we allow the legislature to weigh in as well? What's so bad about that? Now, many people think this is bad. And again, I mean, there's sort of that populist rage that's out there today, both on the left and the right, where people think that, oh, it's the will of the people, right? They really fetishize this direct democracy stuff. America was never founded to run as a direct democracy. In fact, we put in place all sorts of checks and balances, whether it was the Senate or the House of Representatives or the Electoral College or what have you, aimed at protecting us from direct democracy. Right? That this is something we need to be protected against. So I'm very much in favor of this constitutional amendment. And again, it's just for ballot measures that would amend the Constitution. I think it's a good idea. The one thing I'm worried about, and the legislature in North Dakota's got a bad habit of doing this, the one thing I'm worried about is that they are going to put this issue on the ballot and then do almost nothing to make the affirmative case for it. The legislature, they're just going to put it there and then it's going to die because there's going to be a lot of people that come out against it. And I think that this is something that's going to take some explaining to voters, right? I think it's hard to make the case to voters that the voters shouldn't be the end-all, be-all for when the Constitution gets amended. There should be some additional steps in there. I think it's going to be a hard case to make. I hope the legislature backs up the case. I guess we'll see if they do or don't. But anyway, it's a good amendment. Initiated measures are bad. Now my interview with Congressman Kelly Armstrong. This episode of the Plain Talk Podcast is brought to you by Energy of North Dakota. Oil and natural gas from North Dakota strengthens all of America. And through our abundance of talents, innovations, and technologies, energy responsibly produced here translates to worldwide economic stability. With producers and our communities working together, we're securing a sustainable future that generation after generation can build on. It's all happening right now with Energy of North Dakota. Learn more at energyofnorthdakota.com. Congressman Kelly Armstrong joins me now as he does every week to take your questions. Remember, you can submit questions anytime you want to rob@sayanythingblog.com. We record these usually on Thursdays. Every once in a while, the schedule might change a little bit, but usually we record on Thursdays for publication on Friday. So you always hear these on Friday. Keeping that timeline in mind, you can email me anytime. I'll save up the questions and ask Congressman Armstrong when he's on. Also, if you watch my social media feeds on Facebook and Twitter, if you follow me there, I put up threads soliciting questions every week, so you can submit your questions there as well. Kelly, how you doing?
I'm doing great, Rob.
I had a lot of people, and I'm just going to condense it because I had a lot of people just talking to me about it this week, about the vote on renewing the Violence Against Women Act in the House. I'm reading a headline here. It says 157 Republicans just opposed renewing the Violence Against Women Act. This is from the Huffington Post, which might which might explain the tone of the headline. It says they sided with the National Rifle Association over women's safety. Not a good look. And that was the reaction from a lot of people saying, well, why vote against renewing the Violence Against Women Act? Did you, I guess I didn't look up how you voted. How did you vote and why did you vote that way?
Yeah, I actually voted against it twice. I voted against it in committee and I voted against it on the floor. But before that, I voted twice to reauthorize the Violence Against Women Act that expired at the end of last Congress. I voted twice to reauthorize that for a year while we could work out some of these things. And I actually have a little different take on the NRA part of it because it was dealing with some red flag language and domestic assault convictions. But to be honest, our laws in North Dakota are already, I think, really good on those issues and probably more strict than what was in the bill. My problems with the bill involved two other things these were political amendments added on, and they weren't vetted very well at all. And one of them dealt with expanding tribal jurisdiction to non-tribal members, which in theory I support. I mean, if you're on a reservation and you have a girlfriend there and you commit a crime there, I don't particularly care if you're a member of the tribe or not. You can be prosecuted there. But the problem is they don't, when you expand those things, there are certain things that you have to make sure you guarantee. One of them is court-appointed counsel. One of them is and due process rights. The other one is to ensure against double jeopardy. My law firm has actually taken a double jeopardy case to the United States Supreme Court. So this is not something that this is something that I know about. And we tried to get some protections put into the bill for that. And when these big ticket bills come out, there is just no chance of getting any reasonable amendments put into them. And then the other piece of this was withholding funding from faith-based groups if they don't recognize gender identity. And so these amendments were put on to get Republicans to vote no. That's what happened. And not necessarily the tribal jurisdiction one. I really tried to get somebody to fix it. But everybody has some things they don't compromise on. I don't compromise on due process and criminal procedure.
Yeah. Well, that makes a lot of sense. And I think the extending jurisdiction, I'm not a lawyer, so I don't know if I'm using the right terminology, but expanding jurisdiction onto the reservations, my perception of that, and in particular looking in North Dakota, is that I'm not sure the tribal courts are always – I have no problem at all with people. If you commit a crime on the reservation, the local courts, the tribe can hold you accountable. But to do that, every member in the tribe, that's still United States territory. So the Constitution applies, and there are certain rights that have to be protected, like you just said. And so I've always perceived that the problem is I'm not sure the tribal courts are always ready to provide all of those protections. Is that sort of your problem as well?
Yeah, and it's a real problem. Not all tribal courts are the same. So you can expand the jurisdiction, and I would support expanding the jurisdiction. If a crime's committed in your jurisdiction, you should be able to prosecute it, provided you are providing those basic constitutional rights. We haven't even talked about a right to a jury trial if you can spend any time incarcerated. You can't just expand something when you know there's already currently a problem without putting those constitutional protections in place. And Rob, I was a criminal defense attorney for 10 years. I fought about due process in the legislature. It's not about guilt or innocence. It's about ensuring that our constitutional protections are there. And I don't think this bill did enough to do that, so I couldn't support it.
Is there an issue, like you talk about jury trials, like if tribal courts usually pull their juries from the tribe, right? But specifically what we're expanding here is we're giving the tribes the ability to prosecute non-tribal members for crimes committed on tribal land. So here's a problem. If we're guaranteed a jury trial by our peers and you're in a tribal court and all of the jurors are tribal members and you're not a tribal member, do you have a problem there of potential bias? And I'm not saying that anybody on the tribe in the tribe is incapable of serving as a perfectly adequate juror, but we have real problems sometimes with, say an African-American person in an all-white jury. This is something we struggle with in our larger judicial system. Is that an issue for a criminal case on a reservation?
Yes, but I would also I would counterweight that. I've represented Native American clients in district court all across the state of North Dakota. Guess how many Native American jurors I've ever had on a jury?
Fair enough.
I've had zero.
That's a fair point.
One. So you are absolutely correct. It's an issue, but that issue goes both ways, and we need to do a better job.
I agree with that. I agree with that. You're absolutely right. Okay, so violence against women. What were the NRA components? You said some of it was the red flag law. I think it was something like the boyfriend loophole. What's going on with that?
Yeah, it's convictions and removing and guns going on. And to be honest, I was really I will be honest with you. I was really trying to fix a couple of these other things. It's an important issue, and I think one of the frustrating parts down here, and I'm sure we did it as well, but instead of if they would have put the reauthorization of the current bill into on the floor, it would have passed with over 350 bipartisan votes. We could have got it passed through the Senate, and the Violence Against Women Act, exactly how it was a year ago, would be in place right now. But that's not what's going on. They're using it. They're using it for different issues. But the NRA, obviously we had red flag bills in North Dakota. We know how North Dakotans feel about it. I think that was an incredibly problematic bill at the state level, and I think just more the NRA is, and they should be. I mean, these are creatures of state statute. You shouldn't be federalizing criminal law when it's a state crime, and whether that's removing guns from offenders or anything. The answer is those are determinations that are left up to the states.
Yeah,
and like I said, North Dakota has, for as pro Second Amendment as North Dakota is, we are pro Second Amendment for law-abiding gun owners. We do a good job, and we can always do better of making sure people who are convicted of crimes in which they shouldn't have guns don't.
I think always when it comes to these issues, I think it's very easy to say we don't want guns in the hands of dangerous people. I mean, you and I agree with that. I think even your most ardent gun supporters agree with that. The problem is always the problem is always how do we get there, right? The problem is always due process, because who's a bad guy? How are we establishing that somebody's a bad guy? Is it a very thorough process where they have due process and they're allowed to defend themselves, or is it more arbitrary where law enforcement could just be like, well, that guy's dangerous, and take their guns away? The process is important, because again, I say I don't want bad guys to have guns. Well, how are we defining bad guys? How are we determining who's the good guys and who's the bad guys? How do we protect against mission creep from law enforcement? Because as much as I love our friends and cops, they get myopic at times. And, their tool is a hammer and everything starts looking like a nail to them. And that's something we've got to guard against. So, it's always a complicated issue.
And in North Dakota, obviously the felony part applies, but on misdemeanor convictions of violence, like domestic violence, you need a criminal conviction, and then you have a mechanism to do that. And I agree with that. If you are committing crimes of violence, and being criminally convicted beyond a reasonable doubt, then you have forfeited some of your rights, at least for a period of time.
Right.
And then we actually have a pretty good system for domestic violence protection orders in North Dakota. The defendant gets to be heard, or it's the respondent, because it's civil, gets to be heard, is allowed to argue those in case. We have ex parte orders, but you have to have an adversarial hearing within 14 days. So we have those protections built in. Could they be better? They always can be better. But North Dakota is a pretty good state as far as making sure you have your right, you have your due process set up. And I do think the way the language was in this bill, it didn't adequately guard those due process rights. But my point is it wouldn't have superseded North Dakota law. North Dakota has a good process in place.
Did we? We're going to move on to listener questions here. But did we pass recently a bill to restore, like if you got into some trouble that you could restore your gun rights to? I thought we did that. That was a
in
bill
North Dakota?
Before the legislature not that long ago. Didn't we have a bill like that? I can't remember if it passed or not.
There were there's a certain amount of restorations of gun rights. North Dakota also does a really good job of restoring rights. When we were dealing the national election laws. And,
we're restoring voting rights. Yes. So we're one of the best in the nation.
Yes.
Which we should be.
Yes, we are. Yeah, absolutely. The debt to society is debt to society. The problem with the restoration issue always becomes on whether you're on a federal database or not.
Yeah.
You can do a lot of restoration at the state level, but if you can't get the feds to unpig you in a system, you're going to have problems. And I do think we shouldn't. I think there's a difference between violence and nonviolence. And nonviolent crimes should, especially in North Dakota where hunting and outdoors is a way of life, nonviolent crimes shouldn't bar you from that. But depending on what the violent crime is, I think when you commit acts of violence against other people and get convicted, you should forfeit some, other rights.
I'm absolutely fine with that. But I'm also fine with allowing a process where we can go back and reconsider that, give them a process.
Sure.
Maybe it should be, and we can have a debate about that. Hey, I wanted to ask you too, we talked about the States Act last time we were up here dealing with marijuana. You supported 100%.
Yeah.
I think we just ran up against in the legislature this week. It was dealing with, the original bill was, It was regarding your concealed carry license, and it was right now in North Dakota. Basically, a law enforcement officer can demand to see your concealed carry license, and you have to produce it. If you can't produce it, that's a crime. This would have given you
not really.
Okay, well,
we have constitutional carry in North Dakota. Our concealed weapons permits are mostly for reciprocity reasons.
Right. These days. Well, basically, that was the original bill. It was amended, and it basically would have given you 30 days to prove that you could concealed carry if for whatever reason you didn't have your license on you. Anyway, that bill got amended to be, it got added in where BCI could get access to lists of medical marijuana patients. And then they were going to, what Attorney General Wayne Stenhjem said is that they wanted to be able to contact the medical marijuana license holders so that they could tell them, hey, you can't conceal carry, and I mean, during the floor debate, one of the lawmakers asked the bill carrier, or excuse me, the committee chair, if that meant that BCI could go out and seize somebody's guns. And he said, well, I guess they could, but this is more just about warning them that if you're on one list, you can't be on the other. Is that the story? Because that's a real quandary. I mean, states like North Dakota are legal. There's a legal method in North Dakota now through which you could purchase and use marijuana for medical purposes. But that also puts you in contradiction with federal gun laws. Is that one of the things the States Act is looking to solve?
Yeah, I'm not entirely sure if that particular issue is solved in there, but all of these things regarding marijuana are dealing with it. I just signed on to the letter. We're going to promote getting higher education budgets from not being able to get federal research funding for marijuana. We need to redo our banking law with how marijuana goes. And I mean, that whole scenario that you just described shows you the ridiculousness of the federal government's position on marijuana for essentially the last 20 years.
Yeah.
I mean, there are certain things the federal government needs to be involved in, even with marijuana. So the States Act gives more authority to the states, which is always a good idea, especially since we've let them do it anyway. But we do have to deal with the banking regulations, gun regulations, and commercial driving regulations. There are a lot of things that are involved in this that we have to make sure that we need to quit ostriching. As a federal government, I don't think, regardless of how your personal feelings are on marijuana, we're not putting the genie back in the bottle.
Yeah.
So we should have policy at the federal level that actually reflects what is going on across the country. I mean, that's our basic responsibility is for governing in the federal government.
Let's move on to some listener questions. Trevor asks via Facebook, what are the most common misconceptions about North Dakota that you have come across in Washington from lawmakers from other states?
That we don't have summer. People think it's cold in North Dakota 365 days a year. I always tell them what we don't have is spring and fall. We go summer, winter, summer, winter.
Yeah.
But they can't believe when I tell them that it was 7 days in a row where it was over 100 degrees in July this year.
Well, I don't think
so. That's one of the biggest misconceptions.
I read one somewhere that North Dakota is one of the 6 coldest states, but also one of the 6 hottest states. Which I mean, it's a land of extremes. I always tell people too that we're pulling that old Norwegian trick that they did with Greenland and Iceland, right? The Vikings, where we call Iceland's warm, but Greenland's cold, right? So North Dakota, we just tell everybody it's cold. It's not actually cold. It's beautiful. We just don't want any of you to come here.
Absolutely. And then I think the other misconception more from a policy level is we have some broadband deserts. I mean, we need to do a better job of getting access on the reservations and those areas. But I think they think it's way more desolate than it is. Yeah. I always explain North Dakota is rural, but you're never that far away from a community. I mean, we have good rural broadband. We are fully capable of interacting in a 21st century environment. And then probably the other one, and this is particularly more because of national narratives, is they essentially think Western North Dakota is a super fun site because of oil and gas development.
Yeah. Well, that's unfortunate. Let's see. Moving on. Charles asked via Facebook, I'm posting the same question I posted to Senator Kramer. When will something be done about the staggering national debt? No one in D.C. even acknowledges it, and it will soon be too late.
Well, we continue to keep talking about it, but I can tell you the Democrats aren't even putting a budget out, which is not overly exciting for that. So hopefully the Senate will deal with that. But yeah, spending is an issue. We continue to talk about infrastructure and an infrastructure package put in place, and people want to raise gas taxes or anything to deal with that. And my response to that is we're collecting more money than we ever have in the history as a republic, and we still continue to go into debt. But the debt conversation needs to be led by a lot of different leaders, and the answer is you cannot have a debt conversation without talking about mandatory spending. You can't do it. And that is just, I mean, as we walk into a presidential election year, and it gets weaponized for politics, which is often such a big problem here. But yeah, we're $23 trillion in debt, and it continues to go up. And we're not going to grow the economy out of this. So we have to get serious about it.
Now, to the point you just made, Greg wants to talk about Social Security. I think he's got more of a complaint than a question, but Greg says people on Social Security should be entitled to an EBT card equal to what the monthly Social Security is. With medications and heat and electric, there isn't much left over. The gap in Medicare is terrible. Most of all the money gets spent on meds with the deductible. I'm not sure what his question is there, but basically he's saying, there's gaps in some of these programs and they make it hard for the people on them.
Well, and I mean, that's the conversation that, has to happen. I do think with the medication portion of that is one of the areas, and I think you and I have talked about it before. I'm really hopeful, and that we've actually done some of that in oversight. It'll go to ENC, but I'm hopeful that we can get a better handle on prescription drug prices, because that does seem to be one thing both chambers and both parties really want to work on. But through advances in medicine and all of the things that are here, we just live longer, we live healthier. We spend more time on retirement and on these programs, and nobody seems to want to acknowledge that as part of a problem of why the reasons why we're in financial trouble with Social Security and Medicare are actually really good reasons. People are living longer, people are staying and living healthier, and those are good things, but they cause significant financial strains on those programs. And nobody can talk about real solutions to that, because it'll get weaponized and politicized in a way that will be incredibly problematic in the next election.
Luke asks via Twitter, Assange, hero or criminal? Talking about Julian Assange, who was just arrested in London after finally emerging after 7 years from the Ecuadorian embassy. What's your feelings on Mr. Assange?
Well, I think outside of everything else, I'll be interested to see if Sweden brings back the 2 rape charges that are against him out there. And I think that this one will be interesting, because in order to right now, I think all he's charged with is hacking. All the other narrative around all of this and disclosing, military sensitive and top secret information is a huge problem. But if he actually hacked a computer to do that, and if he did, that's a big if. We just talked about due process. At this point, it's still alleged, even if it's Julian Assange, but hacking's a crime. Regardless of what your intentions are, if he is convicted of hacking a government server, that is a criminal act, and he should be prosecuted.
Well, and there's a question here too about what happens with that information. Because I speaking as a member of the media, what happens when somebody commits an illegal hack and then gives it to a third party like WikiLeaks, who publishes it, and then other parties, then from WikiLeaks take that information and publish it, like we saw with the DNC emails, like we saw with the Clinton campaign, with John Podesta's emails. There were all sorts of stories written about what was in those emails, the news media doing it. If is it a crime? Like once something like that's hacked, is it a crime to then use the information when it's out in, that's people like me who publish for a large audience have to ask ourselves, is this that the material's out there and it's newsworthy information about powerful individuals? What do you do with it once it's out?
Yeah, and the First Amendment implications that run with the Assange case are, kind of those countervailing narratives are important discussions to have. That being said, if the information you have was illegally obtained, there are issues as to whether or not you can utilize that. But you want to err on the side of the First Amendment freedoms always, because you will always get into the conversation who polices the policers. But at the end of the day, if you hacked a government server to get that, regardless of who's using it past that is an illegal act, and it needs to be an illegal act. We can't have tolerance. Yeah. There needs to be no tolerance on that. And
there's also all sorts of nuances. What's the difference between somebody outside of an agency hacking into an agency and obtaining information, or somebody in that agency perhaps illegally leaking information, like Chelsea Manning, for instance? There's a question there. And again, what's the difference between an illegal leaker and a whistleblower, right? Some of this is so subjective. It's hard to know it's almost like on a case-by-case basis, you have to look at it, and my conclusion might be different than your conclusion, might be different than the conclusions of people in our audience. So it's not, these are not easy questions.
No, absolutely not. But I mean, seriously, I've been involved in these types of issues. One, top secret needs to matter. And two, obtaining information through illegal means is still obtaining information through illegal means. Whistleblower protections and all of those things are really, really important about what you're seeing going on. But if you obtained it illegally, you shouldn't get whistleblower protection.
Kelly, thanks for your time.
Thanks, Rob.
That's it for today's Plain Talk podcast. Remember, new episodes come out right away in the morning, Monday through Friday. If you're listening to this on a platform that allows you to rate or review, like I guess I just heard that they're getting rid of iTunes. And I don't know when that's going to happen, but if you're using a platform, I don't know which one it is. Stitcher, I know does them. Lots of them allow you to rate or review the podcast you're listening to. If you would leave an honest rating and an honest review, I would sure appreciate it. So far on iTunes, which is kind of the big kahuna when it comes to podcasting, this podcast has a 4.5 star rating based on 16 reviews. I really appreciate everybody who's been leaving honest reviews. I appreciate it. If you want to give any feedback on the show, rob@sayanythingblog.com is the place to do it. I've had, I'll tell you, putting together this podcast has been a learning process for me. I realize sometimes there's maybe been funky things going on with the audio. I'm doing my best to fix that, to make this podcast sound as nice as possible. But hey, I'm always open to input. Sometimes if you don't bring it to my attention, I might not know it's a problem. So don't be afraid to use that email. Email me, rob@sayanythingblog.com. Follow me on social media. I'm at Rob Port on Twitter. I have Facebook profiles for myself and the blog. I'm Rob Port on Facebook. Say Anything Blog, of course, just search for him. Follow the Say Anything Blog accounts on Facebook and Twitter if you just want the political content. If you also want pictures of my kids and baseball commentary randomly, follow the personal ones. And if you do follow me, say hi, because I like it when people say hi. Thanks for listening, and we'll talk again.